This episode of the Move Mind podcast was brought to you by CBD Mountain, the sport and fitness CBD. Head over to cbdmountain.com for a range of soft gels, skin balms, oils, and vapes, and purchase online and have the premium quality CBD delivered directly to your door. cbdmountain.com. Thanks for tuning in to the Move Mind podcast. My guest this episode is Brandon Morgan, a collegiate wrestler who transformed himself into a freak strength powerlifter, a holder of a Bachelor's of Science degree in human kinetics, and strength coach at the infamous Kabuki Strength facility in Portland, Oregon. Brandon, thanks very much for coming on the show, mate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, really psyched for this. Like I said before we went live, been a fan of yours for a while now. Been following how you do stuff yourself and the stuff you've been doing with the virtual coaching and stuff at Kabuki, and love it. So yeah, can't wait to get stuck in to pick your brains a bit. Brandon, I thought we could start then maybe with your grappling, wrestling backgrounds. Why wrestling? What was the initial pull for wrestling and not perhaps the more traditional American sort of sports like basketball, hockey, those kind of the traditional side of things? Why wrestling? What was the appeal there?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. So it probably started off as I was very, very young. So I've always had a really innate need to have the ability to defend others. So I think my first thought towards wanting to try wrestling was actually getting my ass just kicked in elementary school. So somebody like my little girlfriend at the time, someone said something to her, I shoved the kid, and then he just throttled me. And I realized if you want to defend somebody, you got to know how to fight. That's a pretty important prerequisite to actually being able to defend and handle yourself. So it started off with wrestling just because MMA is obviously a thing, but at the same time, there's not a whole lot of organized sport around MMA. So, started off with wrestling. Wrestling's a fantastic base. So started off with that. Played a lot of other sports at the time. For example, I was super into football. I was actually probably more into football at the time. But at the same time, I ended up quickly coming to an end with my football career because of too many concussions. I had some head trauma as a kid, ended up getting ran over by a car, just had a few issues of that nature where even at a young age, football brought on a lot of head trauma to a point, in fact, to where I was actually told I shouldn't play contact sports at all, even wrestling. But I decided to continue on with wrestling. Those kind of advised not to do it. But continued on with wrestling, really enjoyed it. I found out it's a sport you don't have to be that gifted to do, which is probably my favorite part, if you look at football, basketball, I mean, there's just not a whole lot of people in the NBA with my build, if that makes sense. But in wrestling, I mean, it doesn't matter what weight you are, what you look like. Hell, even if you have one leg, you look at Anthony Robles, you look at a lot of athletes that come from all backgrounds that can excel in wrestling if they put in the work, which I absolutely love the idea of. But unfortunately, once I got to college, I ended up having more concussions, more head trauma, ended up having to actually drop out of a few semesters of school. It got so bad. And at that point in time, I decided to just make a complete switch to powerlifting. The reason I switched to powerlifting is mainly because I've just always enjoyed lifting weights. I love the personal challenge to it. I love the fact that you can come in, grind, and anytime you want, and put up some big weights. Always very much admired it. And once I started, I actually realized or started finding out about Kabuki Strength. I started reading about this guy named Chris Duffin, who was squatting 800 plus pounds for reps. That was doing just these ridiculous feats of strength that I couldn't even comprehend at the time. So I ended up making my way to Kabuki Strength and kind of learning some of the principles that they taught. And I couldn't believe it. I absolutely positively could not believe how much it benefited me. Like within a year of using their principles, my total, which for people out there that don't know, the squat, bench, deadlift combined, my total went up a good 150 pounds, 200 pounds in the first year of using their principles, which is unheard of. That doesn't really happen. So it just benefited me in amazing ways. I ended up teaching more and more of my athletes I was coaching at the time about it, started using it to train them. It really set me apart as a strength coach at the time. And the rest is kind of history. I ended up getting more and more tied into Kabuki Strength and ended up starting my career here.
Yeah. It's well, couldn't be a better place, I don't think, really, for you to have stumbled across. I mean, the beauties of living in Oregon, I guess, is you've got that access.
Yeah.
It's a goal of mine to come and see you guys actually once everything opens back up.
Oh, that'd be
You're about
fantastic.
5 hours away from me, yeah. So I reckon I could get a vehicle together and drive down. I'd love to come and see you guys and see what you do in the flesh, and get some coaching from you lot and book some of your time out. It'd be amazing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, wrestling's an interesting beast, isn't it? Like when you said there about defending yourself, it was a similar story for myself, actually. Got the shit kicked out of me being a skateboarder and sticking up for my friends because that was important to me. But
Yeah.
quickly realized that being a punch bag also sucks. So it was a similar kind of angle for me with martial arts too. Wrestling is useful, I would probably say, more so than football. Although football, you can tackle someone to the floor, right? Like you've got that skill. But then what do you do when you hit the floor per se? And I suppose that's wrestling, right? Wrestling is also getting someone down, I know that, but then pinning someone. So did you find you were able to defend yourself, or at least you had the confidence to defend yourself and your friends and loved ones because of wrestling?
Absolutely. And that was the big thing for me. I think my first like legitimate fight, you could say, was in middle school. And I had wrestled for a few years at that point. I was really confident in my ability to do so. And the guy had been that I was fighting. Everybody's like, "Oh, he's a boxer. He's a boxer. He's gonna kick the shit out of you." I just wrestled him. I I hit a blast double. I kept him down for a while. He ended up getting back up, head and armed him. I ended up doing some cool stuff and just took over due to wrestling. But actually, after that, I realized once I get him to the ground, I need to know how to finish it because pinning someone in a fight doesn't really mean a whole lot. There's no referee to say it's over with, right? Doesn't mean a ton. You actually got to learn how to submit your opponent in a sense. So, and that's what kind of started getting me more into jujitsu and MMA and things of that nature, which never really became like never really took off for me. I more so wanted to learn the basics in terms of how to better defend myself and others. But yeah, that was absolutely something that gave me a lot of confidence within my ability to defend myself and people I love, of course.
Yeah. Something like sticking to someone like shit on a blanket is a great fighting tool, isn't it? It's very unnerving for someone like, especially for a striker or that chap who was a boxer. I bet he couldn't believe that you were stuck to him and yeah, ragdolling him around, I bet.
Yeah.
Um, I've heard you say before, Brandon, on tape that you really enjoyed the freestyle Greco
Mm.
style of wrestling. For the people that live under a rock, could you explain roughly what Greco or freestyle Greco is, and what was it about that you liked so much?
Yeah, that's a very solid question. So basically, collegiate wrestling or folk style rather wrestling is the style of wrestling that pretty much only America does. America is the only country that does collegiate style wrestling, or sorry, folk style wrestling. And with that being said, it's basically a style of wrestling that you starting in referees quite a bit. There's not really any points you receive from turning somebody or exposing someone's back. It's just a different rule set. And most of it's the same, but it's a different rule set altogether. But then there's freestyle and Greco, which is done at a world level. In fact, in my personal opinion, America's kind of handicapping itself in terms of the athletes we produce because we only do folk style. And then we get to the Olympics and it's freestyle and Greco only. And we have athletes that have done folk style and folk style only their entire life. And there's definitely a tremendous benefit to starting freestyle and Greco at a young age because it's kind of a different beast altogether in terms of a lot of the techniques they use and the motor patterns they go through. But freestyle is going to be very similar to folk style, except for the fact that you get points for turning someone. You see a lot more throws in it. Just kind of a different rule set altogether. They reward different move sets as well, which is why you'll see a lot more throws, for example. And then Greco is basically a style of wrestling where you just can't touch the leg. So it's throw city. I mean, you're seeing athletes just headbutt, grapple, beat the hell out of each other, and then throw people constantly. And that was the one that I enjoyed the absolute most. That was by far my favorite. I have a very solid center base, and really enjoyed throwing people, really enjoyed just doing one big throw and getting the match over with. I was obviously pretty strong because I started weightlifting at a very, very young age. So that was one I connected the most with and did the best in. But unfortunately, in America, you don't get rewarded a college scholarship for Greco or freestyle. So you kind of got to do it hard and folk style if you actually want to attend to school and get some money out of it.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that there's no real professional outlet for wrestlers once they come out of college, unless they go into. I suppose Jordan Burroughs is a weird example because he's making money on a wrestling circuit now, but that's only been really developed because of him and those like Carl Dake and those kind of guys, right? Like that's new. Previously, I guess you either went into WWF, WWE, or you went into MMA, and we've seen what happens when they go into MMA. They just destroy people. So yeah, it's interesting. Greco, yeah, it's very much just the upper body hit people with the planet.
Exactly. Yeah.
Suited Brandon down to a T. Yeah, I wonder why.
Eh, right.
Yeah, interesting. So you said you got into weightlifting young then as well. So was that to complement football, or was that to complement wrestling, or was that just to explore lifting for lifting's sake?
Yeah, it was actually very similar to the idea just wanting to defend myself better. I found out that if you look scary, you're less likely to get into a conflict. So I wanted to look scary. So it started off with push up pull ups in the basement, and then it developed into actually going to the gym. At a young age, actually, I remember every single morning, 5 a.m. every single morning, I'd ride my bike 6 miles to our high school gym because I only had time to weight lift from like 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. before school started, and then stay there for the rest of the day. But I'd ride my bike super early there just to get a training session in because it's really important to me. In fact, it's been such a consistent part of my life, and this is something that's impossible to validate, so it doesn't mean all that much, but I am very serious when I say it. In 10 years, since I was 14 years old, so actually a little over 10 years, in 10 years, I have not taken over 72 hours without doing a weightlifting session. So haven't gone over 72 hours in over 10 years. You can talk to my parents, they'll say, oh, hell yeah, he's crazy about it. Same thing with the fiance that I've been together with for over 6 years. So it's been a really integral part of my life from a very young age. Started off with just wanting to improve the physique, look a little bit scarier, and then it quickly morphed into something that was more so athletic development. And within the athletic development side, that's where I really started hitting my stride and enjoying things. Once I saw a real benefit to my athleticism, to my performance, both on the football field and especially the wrestling mat, that's when I really started getting into things. And then one day I thought, what if I bench 500 pounds? That'd be that'd be fucking wild. That'd be awesome. So I started kind of dreaming about it, getting more specific within heavier weightlifting goals, and that's when I started kind of taking my shots towards those and morphing into more of a powerlifting slash power building sort of training philosophy.
Yeah, which I'd love to unpack later on. Absolutely, it's interesting, isn't it? For a lot of the DIYers, which I consider yourself to be, myself to be, lots of people that get into stuff, but that perhaps they weren't taught per se by anybody. They found a basement, they discovered what a push up was, and they discovered what hanging from a bar was, and some pull ups. That physique actually was the way in. um, Not necessarily aesthetics, but usually like what you say, especially similar for myself too. Like if you look scarier, if you look like you can handle yourself, people are sort of 50% less likely to start a fight with you. But as you get into the physique door, it becomes a wormhole, and you realize that physique is really just the surface level of what's going on. And just because somebody looks scary doesn't mean they are scary, and all the rest of it. It's interesting that becomes a way in. Yeah, and like bodybuilding, if there's one thing bodybuilding has done really well, it's get people's attention.
Oh yeah. Yeah, big time. A lot of people that look scary, but aren't necessarily so. When you get to them in person, you start to see somebody with a physique like that and some disgusting looking ears. That's how you know you should back off. But besides that,
Yeah, that's it. If they've got the cauliflowers, then maybe think
eh,
twice. Yeah, 100%. I wanted to then, Brandon, if we could unpack a couple of ideas around strength training for grapplers. This is an interesting topic. It's a topic very dear to my heart. I love this
yeah,
this discussion, and you're someone that I really wanted to speak to because you move like a freak and you lift like a freak, and you've got them both. And I admire the hell out of that because it's proof that it can be done.
yeah.
And for a long time, it was always, oh, weights will make you slow and bulky, and wrestling is all about last man standing, or grappling is just about mental toughness and blah 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 blah. Now what we're seeing is S&C is becoming, you know, part and parcel of combat sports training. UFC PI have done very well on sort of bringing that to the limelight.
Oh yeah.
I wondered if we could have a look at a couple of ideas that are out there around different methodologies for sort of strength training for grapplers, maybe unpack them a little bit. I'm sure you're aware of Mr. Eric Bugenhagen slash Ricky Boogs, he's been signed for WWE. He's an absolute fucking monster if you don't know him. Wisconsin heavyweight, I want to say NCAA champion, maybe.
Oh
He's,
wow.
de-
Okay.
he's definitely high up on the collegiate wrestling
Yeah,
front.
that's a big deal.
It's a big deal. He was pretty good, from what I understand, freestyle. Then got into weightlifting in his garage in his basement. He put up horrendous numbers. Jefferson lifts in the 700s.
Jeez.
rack pulls in the thousands. He's a monster, and he's been signed by WWE now as a pro wrestler. And I'm super happy for him because he started his sort of YouTube career with an iPhone, what, 2, filming
Mm,
himself just repping out in his basement with some old plates. And he has been an advocate of what we kind of know now as the Bulgarian Light method. So not the traditional Bulgarian method, for those that don't know, of hitting a max every day, maybe twice a day, probably using steroids, but instead doing his kind of idea. I guess I'll kind of summarize it. They also have called it the Wisconsin method as well. One lift, a chosen rep range between 1 and 5 reps for that day, work up to a max, just a single top set for those reps, and then go home. Do that for 2 weeks, more or less, and then change the lift every day. What do you think of that as a method for wrestlers, grapplers, jiu-jitsu players? Does that have its place? It's quite CNS heavy, you could argue, for that actual lift, but the volume is so low that maybe the recovery is quite good from day to day. I'd be really interested to see what you think maybe on that idea to start with.
yeah, yeah. So when we start talking about different strength training methodologies, it's important to note that it's almost hard to create a program that won't make you stronger if you work hard enough at it. So it's not necessarily a conversation around what does and doesn't work. It's more of a conversation around what's optimal for said athlete. Now, when you look at the Bulgarian style, and then that's somewhat similar, I guess you could say, obviously quite a bit different as well, to like the Westside style and things of that nature, where you're doing a lot of max effort, dynamic effort, things of that nature. There's pros and cons to it. I'll preface this by saying, is it a method that I personally would bias towards with an athlete of mine, like a collegiate wrestler or someone along those lines, where I have a lot of jiu-jitsu athletes? No, not necessarily, but it is a method that I think most people actually start off with a method similar to that. It's super common when you first started out getting into heavier lifting, and I personally have went through it. There's definitely some pros to it too. For example, it drives intent up through the fucking roof, like through the roof. Like when you come into the gym and you get to break PRs or pretty much die trying just about every session. Oh my gosh, it's fun as hell. Are you kidding me?
Yeah,
It's so much fun.
yeah,
You see athletes, their mindset changes. They're so much more intentional with how they warm up, how they lift for that day when they're in that status of mind.
yeah,
And same thing with dynamic effort. When you tell someone, I want you to lift that shit as fast as you can, and we're going to get out a velocity device and we're going to quantify how fast you're moving it and then compare it to your teammate over there who's at the same weight as you. And you guys are going to be competing for a spot. Are you kidding me? That's great. That's awesome. It drives intent through the roof. It gets them in the right mindset. But like you said, from a central nervous system fatigue standpoint, from a movement quality and creating a program that really focuses on benefiting that movement quality from aspects of lifting that I are near and dear to me. They're really important to me. I don't necessarily think it's the most optimal, but man, oh man, are there definitely some pros, and it definitely works. It without a doubt works, but it's not necessarily specifically what I personally would choose per se, because there is some issues with it as well. For example, you'll see a lot of athletes in there who they can't even squat. Like they don't have a good squat pattern. They don't know how to breathe and brace. They don't know how to stabilize their spine. They don't know how to root even remotely effectively. The reasons why it's awesome, it dries up intent, are also somewhat the reasons why it's not so good, because it dries up intent. You have athletes trying to move weights as fast as they can, weights they've never done before, and they don't even have the movement fundamentals down correctly. And they're doing this, and I always say this particular phrase, I always say this particular thing quite often. You'll hear me say it quite often. Unfortunately, strength training for athletes can just as easily be detrimental to them as it can be beneficial. It's unfortunate, but it's absolutely positively true. So yeah, that's a big thing we have to understand. We have to prioritize movement quality first, and unfortunately, within methodologies like that, you will see a lot of poor movement qualities that make an athlete more likely to get injured or experience injuries while they're actually training. And we have to understand the number one most important aspect of strength training for an athlete is to prevent injury. That's it. That's a number one goal. So if I heard of like if let's say a coworker of mine, which by the way I do have coworkers that use it, if I had a coworker of mine that was using it, hell yeah, that's awesome. If that works for your athlete, if that's the best training program for them, you think great, it's going to work. But at the same time, I do have my own personal reservations for it, and I don't necessarily think it's the most conducive to benefiting that athlete, in my personal opinion, practices.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It is so often a case by case basis. If I had a nickel for every time I use that phrase, mate, I'd be making more money than I would be anywhere else. I think it's so true. But
Yeah.
I think what's fascinating about that sort of light Bulgarian approach is, like you say, the intent is very
Yeah.
interesting. I'm biased, right, because I'm doing it myself right now. I'm a lot newer to heavier lifting than yourself, but um, I probably have a training age of about 4 years, and I thought now is a good time to start going down that Bulgarian light wormhole, because I think I do have a good enough base, movement
Yeah.
qualities, etc., to try that. And I have experienced exactly what you just said with the intent. My laser focus, as the boobs would
Yeah.
say, is through the roof. And I go in there, and it's so simple what I have to achieve. My intention is through the roof, and I really like that. But I have noticed the fatigue carry over a little bit. It's usually just harder to start my mornings. A couple of strong coffees, and I can
Mm,
kind of jumpstart the engine a little bit. I do have to keep an eye on tightness and recovery stuff, which I'd like to get get to later with your ideas around that. But I also have noticed that actually I am fresh enough to do my jujitsu and spar, and do my jujitsu training and drills and stuff like that, which is interesting. Now, another methodology I used some couple of years ago was it's called the Wrestler's Edge program. Carmen Bott has put it together. She's from Vancouver, actually, an S&C coach, and it was through Fight Camp Conditioning, sort of the online store. So shout out to her and those guys. And that was really interesting. That was based around seasonal approach. So, your off season, in season, etc.
mm.
An off season example, I'll just give a brief one. It was a 3 days per week program. There was a CNS primer to start, two main lifts, usually one explosive, one controlled, low in technical demand usually, where it was tiered in novice and intermediate and advanced, depending. And then four assistance exercises off the back of that, and then some midsection work and neck work. And I did that for about a year and a half. And I noticed, again, like you said, if you go into a program, you will get stronger, usually, if you stick to it. That's kind of the point. But I also found, on the contrary, that it fucked me up in terms of recovery enough to then go and train. So
Yeah.
I'd have to be very careful about when I timed that training session in relation to my mat time. Um, those sessions took an hour and a half to 2 hours. There's a lot there. There's 7 or 8 things going on there.
Yeah.
I come out the other end pretty fried. And then I try and then go mat time and do my drills and my sparring. I was like, oh, I'm fucked, man. Like, I had to really, really play that wisely. Um, but it's another way, it's another method. A part of me just felt like, yeah, maybe I'm just not tough enough. Like, it's
Mm.
possible. Like, wrestlers are pretty tough. And then you said, like, there's the Westside method as well, which is like a max effort kind of day, or a couple of those, and then a couple of dynamic efforts. So I guess with all that in mind, I'd like to maybe hear a bit more on the Brandon Morgan method, um, and your kind of ideas there. I know we've said it's case by case if you've got an athlete in front of you, but perhaps maybe on your own experience, what has worked really well with yourself, with relation to the sort of stronger for grappling, or also what you've worked with athletes, used with athletes, and seen with them that's worked quite well
Absolutely.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and one thing I'll actually add to the previous discussion, I think it was last year when I think about it a little bit more. I have used actually as of late something similar to like the West Side style of method, or something similar to it at least. And I'm not necessarily not open to doing the future too, because there's definitely some athletes that, man, it connects well with them. It connects really well with them. And that's the thing here. When we start talking about strength training methodologies, it's not an objective, set in stone conversation. It's a conversation that's very subjective. It's going to depend on the athlete themselves. And when it comes to athlete themselves, there's a lot of athletes out there, unfortunately, that they're there to wrestle. Or like in the topic of strength training a wrestler, they want to wrestle. They didn't come to college or and get a scholarship to lift weights. And some of them, unfortunately, just don't have a passion for it. So any way you can drive up intent is a huge priority, absolutely huge priority, especially with certain athletes. Now, some athletes, they almost love weightlifting more than they love wrestling, which kind of presents its own difficulties, I guess you could say. But yeah, it's definitely a case by case basis. Now, in terms of what I personally bias towards, I am very big on assessment of an athlete right when they get done with season. That's really the biggest thing I'm on. With Kabuki Strength here, we have a series of methods and ways that we determine what an athlete needs to work on. And we quantify data with a lot of different metrics, velocity being one of the big ones, a variety of different mobilization drills, and just things to check external, internal hip rotation, things of that nature to make sure that we are addressing all things. Like, for example, I have an athlete right now who's tibial rotation is just garbage. It's so bad. And when you are in on a shot and you don't have certain mobility demands you need to get into the position to finish the takedown, I don't care how strong you are. If you can't get there, you can't get there. You can't utilize that strength in the first place.
Yep.
So something I'm really big on is first assessment. Now, when people ask me, probably the hardest question I get asked is, what method do I use? And every method is kind of within this very tight box for the most part, is in a very tight box, seen in a very specific way. It's, for me, it's impossible to quantify within a statement or name what my training methodology is for athletes. And it's the same thing for how I personally train. If you ask me how I trained, I kind of like a power builder, but I'm also doing front handsprings over people. I'm trying to do a backflip right now. Like it's not something that can be confined within a box or a title. But yeah, assessment's probably the biggest thing. Right when they get done with season, I need to assess them. I need to find out what they are weak in, what they need work in. And for me personally, something I do a little bit differently is I actually like to see their game tapes. I really like to see their game tapes. I like to see, for example, a wrestler or a jiu-jitsu guy, I like to see their move set. I like to see what they predominantly go to, where they seem to fall apart within their technique, and what training capacity needs to be worked on. Because if it's strength, explosiveness, or maybe it's cardio, strength and conditioning. Conditioning is a big part of it. So it could be a lot of different things. So something I do a little bit differently is I'm really big on assessment the second they get done with their season. And then I very much like to, if possible, I very much promote this to see game tape, whether it's jujitsu, wrestling, hell, even volleyball, basketball. I like to see game tape. I like to understand the position I play. I like to see the force vectors that I primarily work within, so on and so forth. And once I have that, I can set up a really nice game plan for the rest of the year or the rest of the off season. And typically it consists of a general preparation phase, a specific preparation phase, and more so very specific sport readiness phase as we get closer to season, or if it's a long season, more so as we get closer to nationals or whatever the big competition is. And within each one of those phases, I have very specific things that we need to work on. Now, obviously, within the general preparation phase, that's when we're going to do the most heavy lifting. That's when we're really going to focus on getting our bone density up if we can, increasing elastic or the tendon and ligament elastic strength, or tensile strength rather, of an athlete up as much as possible. We're really focusing on the anti-injury mechanisms of the athlete themselves. A little less specific, not so much cardio. We're just trying to make the athlete brutally strong, or just work on whatever they need to work on. There's some athletes out there that really don't need to get much stronger. They're already really strong for themselves. They're really robust. They need to work on other things. So the general preparation phase is typically from broad strokes outlook. Typically, when we do the most heavy lifting, working on the most general stuff, we are generally getting them prepared for the season and working on getting them more robust and less likely to get injured. And then the closer we get to season, the more specific we're getting, the more cardio we're doing. We're looking at force vectors, joint angles, the specific cardiovascular demands of athletes, and we're incorporating more and more training methods and exercises and movements that's going to get them prepared for their actual sport. So that's a general broad strokes outlook on it, but it's definitely dependent upon a case-to-case basis. And I think one of the biggest things I do differently is the assessment of not only their movement, mobility demand, so on and so forth, but also their game tape. And then furthermore, movement quality is probably the most important thing to me. Actually, a fun little side note, the big thing that made me want to work for Kabuki Strength the most, the absolute most, was my experience with how much it benefited me. That was definitely the thing that made me want to do it the most. I saw how much it benefited me. I started working with a wide array of different athletes. And then I started looking at some of the top strength training programs for grapplers in the nation. I started looking at some big Division I schools that were known to have really well-funded strength training programs. and they were doing a lot of things that were not, in my opinion, incorrect, but like objectively incorrect. And I'm talking about letting their athletes squat 400 or 500 pounds in running shoes. I'm talking about getting rid of the lactic acid within their muscle. I'm talking about things that have been debunked, disproven, and just objectively incorrect within the realm of lifting heavy shit and trying to get their athletes stronger. So that was really a big boost for me for wanting to become a strength coach myself, and help as many people as I can. And that's kind of the big focus of every strength coach and trainer. I want to help out as many people as I can. But here's the deal: there's only so many hours in a day, so many hours in a week. I'm limited. I'm very limited. So, what's the best way you can help a population of people across the world? Through education. And that's why I'm so big on our seminars. We actually get to teach some renowned strength coach on how to do their job better, clinicians, so on and so forth, which I very much enjoy.
Yeah, no, the virtual side is awesome. I encourage anyone to get on the virtual. Even just the free bits you guys have put up, I've learned a shit ton just from watching those. Yeah, the assessment's really interesting to me. I agree with it as a process. I think if you don't have a semi-objective starting point, good luck on trying to figure out where you're going, because you don't know where you're beginning from. I know there's a million and one methodologies out there to assess, but do you do something like biometrics, velocity testing in a couple of lifts, energy systems? Do you do something like that? I mean, I don't want you to give away all your secrets. I know
No, no,
you
like,
you know, but just from a principles basis.
yeah, so we first put them through a series of mobility drills that's going to expose their issues. A classic one within wrestlers is hip immobilities, whether it's external, internal rotation, whatever it may be. Tibia rotation is another big one. But anyways, we look at a series of different mobility tests, not only for it's not a series that we do on all people. It's a series that are consistent across all athletes, all people, but there's additional ones depending upon the sport. So, for example, wrestling is going to have a lot different mobility demands than volleyball, than basketball. So, there's some specific ones we throw in there due to the sport itself. So, it's mainly going to be circled around mobility, velocity testing within a variety of different lifts to see their ability to be explosive in certain positions. And with our transformer bar, gosh, that is such a help. My gosh, we can test their anterior chain more so, posterior chain more so. We can test a series of different things within the same implement, which is just unbelievably beneficial. But yeah, it's basically testing all sport demands they need to nail. They need to do really well in next season, looking at game tape, and then just assessing the best of our ability so we find out what we actually need to work on, because otherwise we're working in the dark.
Yeah, well, that's really cool. I really like that approach. Right then, let's get a little bit into the kabuki side of things, because, well, again, for people been living under a rock, for those that don't know the mad scientist, Mr. Chris Duffin, could you give a brief insight as one of his proteges, who he is and what he's known for? And then I'd like to unpack with you a little bit. You've mentioned, I read in one of your posts, that your passions, goals, morals, and philosophies line up with Chris's quite well, hence why you're there and you're doing stuff together. And I'd also like to maybe unpack a little bit of what those morals and philosophies and kind of goals are in a second. But who is Chris Duffin, and what is he known for?
Oh, that's a nuanced question. So yeah, from a broad perspective, he is probably, if not one of the strongest individual you will ever meet or see. He has deadlifted over 1,000 pounds for reps. He has squatted over 1,000 pounds for reps. He is the lightest person by far to even squat over 1,000 pounds than he did for reps. Back when he actually power lifted, he set few national records, world records, did quite well. He was somewhat limited due to a variety of different kind of body issues he had. He has really, really rough elbow issues and things of that nature. But he's a very accomplished powerlifter, very accomplished strength athlete. He was also somebody that wrestled in high school. He wrestled quite extensively in high school. He talks about how that really helped him mold and shape his life and helped him with the mental toughness side of things, and it was something he needed to do what he's done today. But he's also a mechanical engineer. He worked with aerospace. He has developed and created some of the craziest barbell designs you'll see, one of them being our transformer bar, our Cadillac bar, our Buffalo bar, shoulder rock, so on and so forth. So yeah, we can go on a long list of things that he's done to get you a better explanation, but he is the mad scientist. He is he is somebody that's very strong, extremely smart and extremely inventive as well. And definitely a great resource to have around you as a coach myself.
Yeah, what a mentor! Like he's the
Yeah.
trifecta of triple trouble, isn't he? He's got the brains, he's got the muscle, and he's inventive, which is really cool. Yeah, some of
Yeah.
the stuff he's. I really want to get one of the transformer bars. Actually, I'm really
Oh,
interested in.
you would love it.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that. So you said that when you got to Kabuki, you were actually put through the system a little bit yourself, and it unlocked, £250 on your total in a year, which is fucking bonkers. If anyone that lifts heavy and knows what that process is like, what was it about what you noticed about the system then, with regards to your own kind of morals and philosophies and passions, that really lined up for you and made you want to stick around?
Yeah, so probably the first thing that I noticed or read or saw from Kabuki Strength that just lit me up was their actual mission statement for the company. And this may not be a direct quote or it word for word, but the basis of it is make the world a better place through strength. That connected with me so well. There is so much bullshit information out there out in the world. And when you talk about Kabuki strength, you typically come to the first thought of developing really good strength athletes, developing, really good just sport athletes, whatever it may be, strength development within athletes. That's usually the first thing that comes to mind, improvements in human performance. But the thing is, the thing that we're big on here is I also want to tackle the fact that somebody in their mid 50s can't pick up their grandchild. I also want to tackle the fact that people are losing all functionality after age 50, after age 60, whatever it may be. I want to increase your play span, not just your lifespan. And unfortunately, we have a healthcare system and philosophy as a nation, hell, even as a world, I think it's fair to say, that's all about lifespan. And we're really big on being fully functional until the day you die, in a sense. And we also have some people at our company that are living examples of this. For example, Rudy Cadla. Our two main owners are Chris Duffin and Rudy. Rudy is 72 years old, I believe, maybe 74, 72, 3, something like that. But he just deadlifted over 500 pounds. He squats, I think, 400 pounds, bench presses over 300 pounds. He is setting world records left and right. He looks very jacked for his age. He functions perfectly. I mean, you compare him to the average person his age, and it is unbelievable. You would not believe they're the same age. And he's kind of a living example of our philosophies put in practice. So that was probably the biggest thing that connected with me, because I've had a lot of family members myself. I've seen a lot of people that fall down the road of just thinking about lifespan. There's a lot of incorrect ideas and understandings about what strength training does for you as you age out in society. And that's something that drove me the craziest. Yes, I love athlete development. Yes, I love getting strong as shit. Yes, I love making barbells and doing inventive things. But something that's very near and dear to me is actually making sure that you can function when you get older and actually enjoy your life, rather than falling and can't getting up and just not being able to do anything. So that was probably the first thing to me that made me think, hell yeah, I love this company. And then the second was, I already touched base on this a little bit, but I mean, you're so limited. I mean, the trainer, strength coach, you'll hear this all the time. You'll hear this all the time. I want to help as many people as possible. You hear that constantly. And when I saw what the top programs and from a Division I collegiate level, many different highly renowned schools and programs and whatnot, when I saw the mistakes they're making, like we'll go to example of squatting heavyweight and running shoes. I mean, there's so many things that are objectively incorrect and concerning about this. The biggest of which is we have this amazing anti-injury mechanism in our brain, where when our brain senses the instability in our foot, it refuses to recruit as many muscle fibers. It refuses to recruit the same strength levels. It does not produce as much force. It just won't. That's an objective fact. And I see people are squatting on these shoes with inches of padding. They're comfy, they're stylish, dog shit to function in. And they're squatting 400 or 500 pounds. Their foot's constantly pronating, supinating, just going crazy. They're on their toes or on their heels. And I look at that from pretty renowned programs and strength coaches that are well known. I looked at that, I'm like, dear, oh dear, something needs to change there. I don't like that. These are athletes, these are wrestlers, these are jiu-jitsu guys that I very much care about and I want to help. And that's unfortunately what's the kind of things that you see out in the world of strength training right now. So when it comes to helping the masses, I love the fact that Kabuki's so big on education. That was another really big one. I mean, when I first started, we were putting on about 12 seminars a year. We did a private one for the LA Dodgers, for example. We work with MLB teams, NFL teams, and then we just also put on normal seminars where primarily the people that come are really well-known clinicians, chiropractors, physical therapists, really well-known strength coaches from Division I college levels, and other people of that nature, where we get to help them understand that that's not the way, and we get to help them strength train their athletes better. Thus, I'm having a bigger effect on the world of strength training and making people's lives better than I could do in person. So that was another really big thing that connected with me personally.
Yeah, that's a fantastic set of values there. Very wholesome. One thing that just came to mind there as you said that, I stole this from, I want to say his name's Peter Aita, but I might have that wrong. But he has a podcast called The Drive, I think. Dr. Peter, someone. Anyway, he's got this idea about the Centurion Olympics. If you were to live to 100 and there was an Olympic event, what faculties and capabilities would you like to be able to do movements at age 100? And based on that list, what would your training look like at age 90, 80, 70, 60, and today? I'd like to ask you that question. What would you like to be
Wow.
capable of at 100 years old in a perfect world, to say that you lived that old, that to that age? What would you be like to be able to be capable of? I mean, oh, Rudy there seems like he's ticked a few of those boxes.
Uh,
If you ask me, it sounds like he's on the right track. But yeah, what would you like to be capable of in the Centurion Olympics?
Yeah, so to preface this, Rudy is unfortunately like exactly what I'd say, but it's a little bit more than that too. It's a little bit more than that. I can't quantify or explain the exact reason why, but it's very important to me to maintain a certain ability to be explosive and to do weird tumbling like stuff. I just like it. I really like it. I mean, for example, I just hit a 515-pound bench press. Super happy about it. I'm nearing a world record. That's kind of the big goal right now. There's not a lot of people that can bench over 500 pounds. I've never met anybody that can bench over 500 pounds and do front handsprings, backflips, things of that nature. So that's something I want to maintain no matter what the hell I do in my life. So that's probably a big one. Is I still want to be fairly explosive. I still want to do box jumps. I still want to do front handsprings. I still want to be able to walk on my hands. Do handstand walks. But more importantly, maybe not more importantly, but also really important, I still want to lift heavy shit and actually be able to step on the platform, hit some world records, and continue doing what I love, which is optimizing human performance and lifting heavy shit.
Yeah, yeah, I like the tumbling passion you have. So, are you? Did you say you're learning to backflip at the moment?
Yeah, so that's my big one. So I'll tell you what, I can do some pretty cool stuff in terms of like front handsprings over people's back. Do a bunch of them in a row. I even do that thing where people hold your foot and then you can do a backflip because it kind of push you up a little bit. I did that at one point when I was 170. But even at my most athletic, I couldn't backflip. I'd always bail out. There is just, I don't know. I don't know if I'm just, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm just too much of a pansy or what it is, but I just couldn't get myself to do it. I'm sure if I worked hard enough, I know I could. People that are far less, able, I guess you could say, I see them crank them out all the time. That's something I really want to do, especially at 240 now, being able to do it at, 5'9", 240, being able to do some stuff like that. I mean, that's rare and really important to me. So yeah, I'm working on a backflip right now. It's
Yeah,
soon to come, hopefully.
you've got power. You got the power. I've seen you jump. I've seen you handspring. So the way I learn, I was self-taught actually, but
Oh wow.
yeah, I had the psych and the want. I just didn't have any technique. But I started into swimming pools as soon as I could
Oh,
come
okay.
full road. Yeah, because I was like, well, the if you fuck up in a swimming pool, I mean, you just sort of get a bit of a slap on the water and that's it. Or if you really fuck up, you'll hit your face on the ledge. But most people don't do that. Most people
Yeah.
like do a Chris Jericho moonsault and they'll fly really too far back. So once I started to get like more or less the full rotation from a ledge height, I started doing it off the edge of the swimming pool. Once I started coming full circle round on that, I took it to grass, and then from grass I took it to concrete. Now, if I was to teach
Mm,
someone, I've taught lots of people to backflip. Since that, I would take a different approach. And
okay.
if I was coaching you, what I'd do first is I'd set you up on a ledge slightly above a crash mat, and I hold your belt line basically,
Mm,
and I teach you how to take off in a good like hollow body tuck position, and like set your focal point straight in front of you, so like at eye level, and learn how to tuck your chin as you do that. Because what most people do is they throw with their head first, like a Pez dispenser, and then that fucks up their whole rotation, and then they open early because they're scared, and then that's when you see the face plants and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So I teach you how to jump with support first. Once you get the hang of that, I then basically cowboy your lower back as hard as I can with the belt line and hold your belt so that you've got no choice but to come full rotation round onto your feet. That is pretty disorientating for the first 25 reps. And then after that, you start to see the mat. You start to see your landing. And then I just basically keep doing that with you until you're able to generate the force and stay closed until you see the mat and open. And then I take just my my hand in the small of your back and just give you the whip with no belt grab.
Yeah.
And then once you've done 25 to 50 of those, you'll start to see the mat on your own and the timing, and you'll feel it. And then from there, I'm just stand back and just let you fuck it up a few times with the crash mat. And then from there, I'll take the ledge away and then make you do it at the same level as the crash mat, because by that point you figured out the rotation basically. And it's all about the timing of opening. Everyone that has the psych out, they open too early, right?
And that's me.
Yeah, and that's totally normal. Most people do that. But once you understand that it's safer to be a Sonic the Hedgehog and stay tucked, you'll figure out that actually, like, it's not that scary. And then once you've come round and you've over rotated, that's the best feeling. If you over rotate and almost like land on your bum and like turtle rock onto your back, you know you've held it closed for too long. And then from there, you'll figure out the happy medium of sticking it to your feet. So yeah, I've got every faith you'd smash it. It takes it's probably like 250 reps, something like that, from start to crash mat competence, I'd say. And then from crash mat, take it to grass, and from grass, take it to concrete, and then you've got your party trick.
See, I'll tell you what, you might have to write up an article on that one, because I think that'd be a good one. Step-by-step process of learning.
It's
the
interesting.
process I learned versus the process I would suggest.
Yeah, exactly, because it's skills development, and you understand skills. Strength is a skill, and there's a sensible framework for skill acquisition. But because of the psych component of a backflip, there's some really interesting ways to kind of outsmart the human's default of freaking out. Which in that case is the opening early. So yeah, I mean, mate, if I ever come down to Portland, I'll do a session with you, and we'll get some crash mat flips going. It'll be great.
I was about to say, yeah, you should come down for a few days, catch some training sessions, meet the big guy, get some team training sessions, and then teach me how to backflip while you're at it.
Yeah, that'd be sick. Yeah. So another phrase I've seen you chuck around, you lift heavy and you do it often, is the recovery, or earning your recovery. In my experience, and I'm sure it's similar for you, getting strong, it carries with it a kind of increase of stiffness in the human body, or at least the day after. For myself, I notice. And if I leave those stiffnesses to kind of accumulate, I have to then like go and release muscle groups and stretch them, and then sort of activate them and stuff like that. What do you mean by earning your recovery, and how do you stay on top of it personally to be able to continue to lift such heavy weights and not kind of let it accumulate into a problem?
That's a really good one. So the biggest piece of actually earning your recovery is something that's fairly obvious. You got to earn it by doing it right the first time. So, not letting yourself go crazy while lifting, not getting overly psyched up and just dropping the whole 100 miles an hour, changing your pattern and messing something up. So that's probably the first step. But anyways, that's not really a step that I usually talk about here. The big step I talk about is the most important components for recovery are things like sleep. That is probably the biggest one. When it comes to the central nervous system adaptations, lifting heavy shit again and again and again, I mean, sleep is so important. And somebody that knows this real well is the big guy, Chris Duffin. I mean, when he was doing his, I think it was the 800 squat every day for 30 days straight for charity. Can you imagine, by the way? Can you fucking imagine? Oh, as I was near it watching it, I was just like, man, is this real life every single day? But he would sleep like 14 hours a day. He would sleep so much. He would take naps constantly. Unfortunately, at that time, we had a smaller facility. Like Kabuki Strength's like tripled in size in the last year. But we had a smaller facility at the time. We were actually sharing the podcast room, video room with a couch that he liked to take naps on. So we would have to postpone doing certain videos so he can get his 45-minute, hour-long nap in or whatever it may be. But sleep is super important, as I point, especially when it comes to CNS adaptations. In fact, even more important than say bodybuilding. A lot of bodybuilders can get away with sleeping, 5-6 hours a night. It's going to hurt muscle protein synthesis to an extent and things like that, but it's definitely not as important as being a strength athlete or trying to get stronger from a central nervous system adaptation standpoint. But sleep is a big one. Nutrition is the big one. So those are probably the big two we talk about constantly. If you are trying to optimize your movement, your strength adaptations, and you are not sleeping well, you are not working that hard. You cannot grind in the gym day in and day out, say that you'll do anything to get better, and then sleep 6 hours a night. That's an oxymoron. You can't do that. You can certainly try, but you're not being truthful to yourself. That's an important piece, and a lot of people forget about that. So sleep and nutrition's probably the big two. And then we start to get into more so tissue manipulations. We start to get more into movement drills, getting in some really good preparatory work in before you go to actually lift, spending your time actually warming up, getting your body prepared to actually perform well. And then, of course, when you get done, spending the time that you need doing tissue work, additional movement drills to assist in better mobility and better recovery, and things of that nature. So that's really the big thing that we talk about here, because it doesn't matter how hard you grind in the gym, if you are not sleeping right, if your nutrition's shit, or if you're not spending your hours you need across the week to do tissue work and movement drills, you're not actually working that hard, and you're putting yourself in a detrimental position to experience a lot of injuries. So that's kind of the main ideas behind earning a recovery. You got to earn strength, you got to work hard in the gym, but that's not where it ends. It continues when it comes to earning your recovery as well, to actually achieve a higher training frequency, to achieve a higher training intensity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is as important. I think as you get more experienced in your training, you start to realize that, don't you? Do you use HRV at all, or are you familiar with using it, or do you think it's not really that necessary, or if you get your sleep and nutrition in order?
Oh, there's so many acronyms. Remind me again what that is.
HRV, like heart rate variability, is kind of,
Yes.
the straps
Yes.
you see people wearing and the apps, and it's all pretty technical from how I see it, but it's quite interesting.
It is quite interesting. It's one of those ones that I'm really excited about. I think there's some good data behind. There's been some good applications of it. It's not something that I use too heavily. I think it has a really good time and place, especially for like sport athletes and things like that. They're really trying to develop a certain degree of cardiovascular ability. But I also like it a lot for sleep. So that ring, what's that called? The Aura ring or something like
Yep,
that?
yep,
Yeah, so like, a lot of athletes are really big on that right now, and that's one of the many things that measures as you sleep to actually assess sleep quality and other
yep.
metrics of that nature. So in that sense, it can be extremely helpful. I think there's a lot of applications for it for the future, but it's not necessarily something that I personally have had a ton of experience using.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I haven't really either, but my one of my last guests on the show, Andrew Reed from Australia, is pretty clued up on the HRV side of things. So I'm going to give it a go, and like he gave some really interesting advice as to how it relates to your jiu-jitsu and lifting kind of together in your
Yeah.
recovery. So I'm going to give it a little experiment, I think, see how we go with that. With your own training then, Brandon, with that idea on sort of recovery, what does a typical session for Brandon in 2021 look like roughly from start to finish? Like, I would imagine you probably trained either today or yesterday. I know you're working to your 533 world record, but what what would a session for Brandon look like from the moment you kind of step in the gym to the moment you've done your last bit?
Yes, the first thing I'm doing is a lot of different movement drills to actually assess my ability to lift that day. The first thing I do is movement drills that more so facilitate assessment. For example, I'll do like 90-90 transition, something of that nature. And I can definitely feel when I have a issue with mobilization. I can definitely feel when I'm going to have an issue with my squat, my deadlift, whatever it may be. So I start to cater the warm up specifically to my readiness for the day. So the movement drills that I do, the prep drills I do before lifting somewhat vary training session to training session, even if it's the exact same training session the following week, depending upon how my body's feeling. For example, actually recently what I did was I clearly have the build for this. I started playing soccer, not like legitimately. I just did it one day with a nephew, and My God, my right side. It's a very unilateral sport, obviously, and the whole right side of my leg, it just got a stimulus I wasn't used to. So the whole right side of my leg, I could not externally rotate, or yeah, externally rotate to save my life. I had fatigue and muscles that I was not remotely used to. So I went in to train the next day. Which, by the way, I'm talking about all of 20 minutes of soccer. So it's actually quite sad. But I went the next day. I did my mobility drills, and I ended up doing my assessment, finding out I had a lot of shit I had to work on that was not something I typically had to work on due to receiving a stimulus and a something that I wasn't used to having. So I had to completely change my warm up to adapt to that, spending more time, particularly on working on the right side in which I kicked from. So I will say that the warm up and preparedness side of things varies quite a bit. But yeah, typically series of different movement drills to address or to get myself prepared to lift. Next thing I'm gonna do is 4 to 6 warm-up sets, start getting into my heavier lifting, always starting off with the main compounds first. Then I got the velocity device, a big part of what we use to indicate load, because there's objective indicators of load and there's subjective indicators of load. Subjective, we start to talk about reps in reserve, RPE, and other questionnaire type of things that are subjective, and those are very worthwhile, great things to use. But unfortunately, I'm one of them. Chris Duffin is actually even better example of this. There's some athletes that just don't do well with subjective indicators. The problem
Yeah,
is
me
they
too.
believe in themselves too much. Yeah, they believe themselves too much. They get done with a set of 2 that they clearly had no reps in reserve on, that clearly it was a RPE 10, and they report back an RPE 8. They report back they had 2 or 3 reps in reserve. And as much as I don't like to admit this is something that I fall into the trap of. So I have to keep myself accountable. I have to go with more objective indicators when available, which is where velocity comes in. So I usually put the velocity device down. I start to do my warm-up sets, get to my working weight, and decide my working weight for the day, not only on the progressions I've taken lately, the goals I need to hit, but also on the actual velocity that I'm producing. So that will actually decide the kind of load range I'll use for the day. And I use the velocity devices to decide load range, to determine if I'm hitting depth or not, because there's a range of motion indicator as well, which is really helpful. And it gives you a few other metrics like that that are really, really important and valid. But anyways, really use a velocity device. You love it to death. Do the rest of my session. And then the second I get done, I'm typically doing quite a bit of extensive tissue work. Usually I use some of our heavier tools like our geisha to kind of roll out just the primary movers I use for the day. So if it's going to be squats, obviously the quads, the hamstrings, the glutes, so on and so forth. Do a few movement drills as well for recovery reasons too. And then I'm out for the day.
Nice. Yeah. What's the velocity device that you favor? Is there a brand or a
Ooh,
is
yeah.
it
So
am I
there's
thinking of the one where it's got like a wire on it and it runs out of a box, that kind of idea? You got one there. Amazing.
so yeah. So this is one that I'm actually using right now. I think it's Virtue, something like that. We actually sell it in our store. But yeah, it's going to be a tethered unit. So velocity devices are unfortunately there's not a huge market for them as of right now. There's not a lot of competition, so they're pretty expensive still at this point because there's not a ton of companies that make them, and they're pretty hard to make from my understanding. So with that being said, the 2 devices we primarily use at Kabuki are this one, Virtue, and Open Barbell. They have great tethered units. There's another one. Oh shit, I am spacing the name, but there's another one that uses infrared technology that we sell and use very heavily as well, and it is awesome. The best part about it is you lay down a mat, you put something on top of the cap of the bar, and there's no tether. There's no real worry that you're going to break the device, because that's the one issue with this. You deadlift and don't have it strapped down well enough. There goes a $200, $300 device just like that, which is pretty rough to have happen.
Yeah.
The one issue though is within strength athletes, what's the big difference between us and sport athletes? Sport athletes are really focusing on higher velocities. They're really focusing on getting more explosive, so on and so forth. With strength athletes, we get really good at moving heavy shit slow. Some of the best powerlifters in the world, they really don't move that fast with their maximal loads. But when you notice somebody that's less adapted, less CNS adapted, more of a sport athlete that's very explosive, they can go to 95%. They're still moving things really fast. They go 10 pounds up and they fail. They don't really have the capabilities or the adaptations to move things slow. With that being said, the infrared technology unfortunately doesn't read slower movements. So that's the one unfortunate part about it. I love a lot of the new devices that are being made using that technology, the non-tethered units, but unfortunately for strength athletes that are squatting, benching, deadlifting really, really heavy, typically a little bit slower, they don't have accurate readings because you're moving so slow. So that's where you have to use a tethered unit. So at this point in time, if you're a strength athlete, you kind of have to bias towards tethered units. But for sport athletes, I do bias towards infrared technology just because it's easier to put on and it's really, really neat and gives you a bunch of cool metrics.
Yeah, that's sick. Yeah, I like that. Objective measures. I saw them when they started coming out a couple of years ago, people using them. So yeah, I'm interested to learn more about that, go down that wormhole, especially when it comes to load selection. That's very cool that
Oh, yeah.
you're using that. Yeah, especially, well, you're already in the high numbers, so it makes sense that you want to be more specific there because you're trying to eke out extra bits of strength which take a bit longer because you're already quite top end, right? Um,
Absolutely.
I've heard you talk a little bit as well, Brandon, about like lifts that suit body types. I think this is an important topic because anatomy in jiu-jitsu as well as strength training does play a role in strategy, game plans, etc. On the mats. Um, and I would say for lever and moment arms when it comes to lifts, how would you advise beginner lifters when it comes to discovering lifts that would work for them and that they should invest time into? There's so many lifts. I mean, there's not, but there's so many variations of lifts.
Yeah.
How would you say to someone, is it worth their time finding a lift that suits their body type? Is it better to go down and start putting more time into a lift that would address their weaknesses? How do you guys go about that, or how do you go about that?
It's a very solid question. So the first thing I want to mention there is when it comes to like anatomical variation, lifter to lifter, it is so unbelievably important to understand that. Understand it exists, respect it, because that's probably one of the biggest frustrations I have as a strength coach looking at other people in the industry. They don't respect anatomical differences between lifters. They look at a lifter that goes into a little bit of butt wink or lumbar flexion, posterior pelvic tilt at the end of a squat, and they don't hit a crazy depth. I guess you could say they have trouble even breaking 90 degrees, and they immediately come to a conclusion it's a mobility issue. It's a mobility issue. So they start chasing their tail, trying to chase something that doesn't actually exist. Really, they just have a deeper hip socket. Really, they just have a different hip morphology. So that's one of the big things we have to understand is the length of your femur, your hip morphology, things like this, your individual body leverages, things like this very much vary. How you're going to lift, what parts of the lift you're going to struggle with more, what lifts you are going to bias towards, especially when it comes to like, are you a sumo deadlifter or a conventional deadlifter? Neither one is easy, despite popular belief. It's just if you're built in a certain way, you're going to bias towards one or the other. So that's the first thing I always like to mention there. Now, when it comes to assessing what lift is best for you particularly, I do think I wish there was a really easy step-by-step process to doing so that I know of, but unfortunately, there's really not that I would suggest. Like for me personally, the kind of methods or practices I use is the first thing, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to look at like let's go with the example of wrestler because I love wrestling, I love jiu-jitsu. I look at the example of a wrestler and what kind of wrestler are they? Are they somebody that is longer, doing a lot of ankle picks, super ducks, whatever it may be, a lot of outside singles, or producing a lot more lateral motion, whatever it may be? Or are you a Jordan Burroughs? They're just blast doubling everybody. Like there's move sets that are going to require different force vectors being trained more to take advantage of you being better at that move. There's different move sets that are going to have different force productions. There's different move sets that are going to have different joint angles. So that's the first thing we got to look at is what's your move set? What is your sport actually requiring? Because when it comes to strength adaptations getting stronger, it's force vector specific. Now, force vectors is something that's a really nuanced discussion. It basically starts to talk about, it brings physics into the discussion of picking certain exercise selection. And it's I don't know much about physics. I just know enough to understand what each sport action is going to need to train in the gym based on the basics of physics. And with that being said, there's been a few well-done studies, one of which in 2016, I hope I don't butcher this. It's always hard to remember a lot of studies in terms of exact practices they use in the methodology, but is basically a study that set out to decide, was a front squat or a hip thrust better for sprinting speed? And they did several different measures. And some of the measures they did were more so vertical. Some of the measures they did were more so horizontal. So for example, they did a vertical jump, a horizontal jump, and a few different distances within running. 6 weeks, 2-time week training frequency, 4 sets of each exercise, something along those lines. And what they actually found was that hip thrusts benefited sprinting more and horizontal jumping more, while front squats massively benefited more vertical jumping. And it's because strength adaptations are force vector specific. So when you're looking at what you need to get better at, having an understanding, or at least a basic understanding, we teach this heavily in our seminars, having a basic understanding of what force vectors are used and required to do well in your sport, or specifically your move set or position on the field or whatever it may be. For example, a goalie in soccer is going to be a lot different than, I don't know soccer, than another position. But yeah, so the first place we go down is in terms of exercise selection and deciding what you need to train heavily and work on. We look at force vectors. We then look at joint angles. We then look at ranges of motion. We then look at loading potential. We then look at the duration that you're going to be in those force vectors. We kind of go down a long list of things to decide what exercise selection is going to be best for you. And then the second part is the actual assessment of athlete themselves, as they discussed earlier, with checking mobility requirements, checking what movements are the weakest in, least explosive in. So with a combination of assessing sport needs, your individual athlete needs in terms of how you play the sport, your move set in wrestling, for example, and your current capabilities, we combine those things to find the right exercise for you. But unfortunately, it's a pretty detailed, lengthy, and nuanced process that you have to have a good understanding of. Like a lot of things in life, there's just no easy way to do it if you want to do it optimally.
Yeah, Kyle, it really makes me want to come down to Portland even more and
Eh,
go through the testing to see what I come out with. It makes sense though that that's why you look at tape, because one of the criticisms with jiu-jitsu, for example, is it's such a 4-dimensional, maddening matrix of moves that it's almost, there's too many. I still think it's infinite actually, in terms of what's possible, or at least there's so many fucking combinations. It seems infinite. That to start looking at that data to produce exercise selection would be stupid, and just you'd never come out with an answer. You'd still be studying 10 years later. Whereas if you look at what the player does for their own instinct, perhaps towards the game, you've already narrowed down your matrix, haven't you, as to what they favor, and then
yeah,
from there you can base it on what they're kind of doing, as opposed to looking at jiu-jitsu as a whole from a distance. It's just too maddening to try and make, an exercise that would benefit a diving Kimura or something. It just it just
yeah.
doesn't work like that, right? It seems, yeah, if you look at the tape and you look at the athletes' favored strategies per se, which usually, if they're any good, especially I would imagine wrestling too, but definitely in jiu-jitsu, they'll base their strength, or their strategies rather, on their anatomical strength. I have really short legs. I don't really pop that many arm bars and triangles.
Yeah,
I just don't really do it. It doesn't really suit me. I much rather attack other people's legs, for
yeah.
example.
Yeah, something I say quite often is that if you look at the sport as a whole to decide on program design or exercise selection, you end up in a wormhole. It's too broad. It's way too broad. And just like you said there, I love the fact that you said that. Really like that, because I'm the same way. If I had a wrestling partner in college that was just lengthy as hell. They were built like, gosh, I don't know how to describe it. They're just lengthy. They're super lengthy. They're almost like an Anderson Silva kind of build, very, very lengthy. And I am the polar opposite. If you strength trained us the same because we're wrestlers, it is going to be, I don't want to say a dog shit program, but it's not going to be optimal by any means. With that being said, my move sets are more so based on my personal strengths along with my anatomy. I'm never going to be that good of a leg rider. I'm never going to be someone that cranks out ankle picks left and right. My arms are too damn short. I'm built like a T-Rex. There's a reason I like to bench press. So with that being said, don't end up in a wormhole. Don't be so damn general. We got to learn how to break it down towards the athlete themselves.
Yeah, that's very smart. So when you were just going back a stage or two, when you found out the lifts that worked for you, before Kabuki, I would imagine, or maybe Kabuki helped you find those. But was it just trial and error? Because like you say, you found out that you got short arms, so that's good leverages for pressing. Do you have short legs?
Yeah, I'm
Or
a stubby individual.
yeah, I'm similar. I
Actually, if
think
you
we're,
don't mind,
yeah.
if you look at these bad boys here, palm to finger doesn't even make sense. Like, what is that? Like,
Whoa.
it took me way too long to realize I am not built like a normal person. But yeah, that's another example. I have a very different build.
Yeah, yeah. So I suppose once you started discovering that, you realised the lifts that would really suit you. I guess it's trial and
Absolutely.
error, I suppose, isn't it? A lot of this, we're into our own things in such a passionate way that we're willing to spend hours in the basement discovering what we like. And I think when it comes to like finding lifts, if you're not getting expert advice from someone like yourself and guys at Kabuki, you just got to sort of just try stuff, right, and just see what works. Like I'm short-legged, so like conventional deadlifts are pain in the ass for me. It's just like a sumo suits me better. Even just like block pulls, I much prefer just because it's just easier to hold the fucking bar, But
Yeah.
yeah, anatomy is a fascinating conundrum like that. Brennan, I appreciate you got a rest of the day to crack on with, so I won't keep you too much longer. But I was just interested, like we unpacked a bit of your coaching sort of philosophy there with strength coaching, which I thought was fantastic and very wholesome. I'm interested to know, what advice would you give yourself back when you began strength coaching, now that you're more experienced?
So the very first thing I would say, like in we're talking about as an athlete, correct? Yes.
Yeah, as an athlete, and then also Brandon strength coach 2021,
Mm,
teaching Brandon strength coach day one.
yeah. So when it comes to athlete side of things, the very first thing I'd say is stop it with the ego, man. No more ego. You got to cut that shit. You're gonna mess yourself up. I think every injury I have now was a consequence of something I did bad back then. So that's the very first thing I tell myself is cut down the ego. If the lift's not there that day, it's not there. Stop focusing so much on load progression. Focus more on technique progression and benefiting the actual motor patterns you're using to execute lifts with more efficiency. That's definitely the very first thing I'd say to myself as an athlete. The next thing I'd say is you have plenty of years to develop a really good bench press. Let's get better at the sport you're playing. There is definitely a point in time where I got super focused. Like it was just, it's been a passion of mine for so long to hit certain numbers within powerlifting. And once I got to college and I got my first concussion in college, that is, I ended up lifting more and more just I couldn't wrestle for the longest time. And the more I lifted, the better I got, the more I'm like, man, this powerlifting shit's really cool. And then there was a certain point in time towards the very end of my career, and looking back on, didn't make a big difference now because I would have stopped anyways, unfortunately, due to prior conditions. But I would have definitely told myself like, hey, bench pressing is great. You can still maintain strength, but you don't need a bench press with a three times a week frequency. You should be doing more of this and that and this and that. So advice like that would be really important for me as a young athlete, just cutting the ego, focusing more on sport specificity, and probably most importantly, also building up certain components of cardiovascular ability rather than focusing so much into developing the physique. Because unfortunately, I got really into bodybuilding too, which not a bad thing in itself, but I focus a little bit more on biceps and plyometrics, for example, which isn't the best thing. And then for a young coach, a baby trainer, Brandon, I guess you could say, the biggest thing I'd say is I'll give you an example. The most I knew about strength training in my entire life was when I first started, because I thought I knew everything. I thought I knew everything. I thought everything was I was dogmatic with my opinions. I thought everything was so cut and dry, black and white, no gray area, ass to grass squat. Why would you go why wouldn't you do that? I was very much stuck within a very certain set of philosophies and ways of doing things. And it ended up really costing me in terms of being the best coach I could be. So the longer I've done this, the more I realize I don't know. It's kind of a cliche statement, but my God, is it important? It is so important. I mean, the more you know, the more you don't know, and that really is such a true statement. So yeah, the biggest thing I'd say is just be less dogmatic with your opinions, chase education, and stop doing research by Googling things, and start getting into some Kabuki seminars, some actual seminars and educational resources that that are catered towards what you want to get better at. And I would just really tell myself to value more education, because my first few years of being a trainer, it was a little bit more dogmatic. It was a little bit more kind of stuck in my own ways. And then as I started to get more involved with Kabuki, saw how much their methods benefited me. That's when I really started opening my mind up to new approaches, and started going to seminars left and right. My God, I practically worked just to go to seminars and get additional education. I really valued education at a certain point, and that's when my career started taking off and I started becoming really good at what I do. So, yeah, that's a few of the first things that come to mind for sure.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. That's really cool. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I think everyone that starts their strength coaching journey knows it all.
Right.
I've certainly been guilty of that myself until, yeah, I think it was from like just reading books, just reading other people's like experiences. And now I guess we have digital media too, but realizing now that I know fuck all really. And I know a lot more than I did 7 years ago, a ton.
Yeah.
I compared to the wormhole of what's out there, I'm like, man, you're just a newbie, really. But that alone just shows maturity, doesn't it, and progression and growth. I think as a coach. Now, this is a similar kind of question, but is there any advice that you've been given? I mean, I imagine, like I want to ask you next who's influenced your coaching career, and I can tell one person who definitely has, but is there any advice that you've been given as well as you were coming up as a coach that has stuck with you?
Yeah. Let me think of, yeah.
I mean, it might relate to what you just said about like not being so cut and
Yeah.
dry and so dogmatic as something like that.
Yeah, so probably the biggest thing that somebody taught me at some point in time is that when you're really young, and this is similar to what I just said, but this was very particular person gave me this advice. I think it was Kyle Young, who's another coach on staff. This is when I first started getting into Kabuki. He just says, chase education, get your degree. But when you get to your degree, just know it's not over. It's not over by a long shot. And that's something I do want to unpack a little bit because I do think it's important. When I got done with my degree, which, a degree in what I got a degree in Health and Human Connects, it sounds like you know your shit, and you definitely do to an extent. But I still didn't know how to cue a squat. Like
Right.
there's something wrong there. Like actually like think about it from a logical standpoint. There's actually something wrong there. We should be taught more about human movement, more about how to be a better coach and cue people effectively. But I mean, you get done with a bachelor's degree, which has some serious meaning to it, and you don't even know how to cue a squat. That's not good. That's really not good. So
Yeah.
with that being said, probably the best advice I got is that when you get your degree, that's not when it stops. That's not when education's over. It's far from over. And having a degree in itself, it does not mean jack shit when it comes to being the best coach you can be. So that was probably by far the best advice I got. And then the second best advice would probably be network like crazy in your years in college. I got that advice when I was like halfway through college. I was kind of a what do you call it? I was kind of like a recluse. I wasn't really talking to a whole lot of a whole lot of staff, a whole lot of the other students there. And then someone gave me that advice. I was like, man, that's really good advice. So I started networking really well, meeting more people, and it's led to some fantastic relationships and opportunities in my life. So I turned up the networking, turned up the communication between me and my colleagues and other people around the university I attended, and it benefited me massively, like just unbelievably so. So those are two pieces of advice that I'd say really changed things for me and made a very meaningful difference in my life.
Yeah, amazing. Well, how does someone go from being a recluse to being a pro networker? Because if you're semi-introverted, or maybe even shy or whatever, it's not the easiest thing, is it, to go out and network? Sometimes it can feel ingenuine, sometimes it's just damn scary. What shift did you make to go, right, I recognize I might be being more reclusive than I need to be? How do I start going talking to people?
That's a fantastic question. So this is something. So so when I had my series of concussions, and basically it was like three in my college wrestling career that only lasted like 2 years. It was three concussions. The last two were god awful. Were just absolutely terrible. They're so bad that I spent like at least a month in a dark room. Couldn't even look at my phone. Like it was legit and very severe head trauma.
Wow.
And I was having some behavioral issues in terms of just not being able to control my anger, not being just the nicest person to be around, not staying in contact with family, things that are not typical of me by any means. But I've always been a bit of an introvert. But after the head trauma, especially the most severe ones that took place at the end of my wrestling career, it got really bad, really, really bad. And what ended up happening was I had to drop out of a semester of school. I was not being very proactive with talking to my counselor, with talking to people who are trying to help me. And at one point in time, I had a very particular advisor at the time that told me, and I was, by the way, important to preface this, I was roofing at the time. I was roofing as a job. And if you don't know anything about roofing, it is just
Brutal.
god awful. Like there's nothing remotely enjoyable about it. It's decent money, but that's the only positive thing you can say about it. And it's only good money because you're putting yourself at risk of death. So it's not. It's kind of a trade off for sure. But yeah, my advisor literally told me one day. He goes, "Well, I mean, you're 2 years into college and you have a semester worth of credits. I would seriously suggest starting to fill out applications. Maybe you can do roofing. It'd be a good career for you. You make them some good money and you're already doing it." And the second he told me that, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe it. I like sat back for a second. I was like, I do not want to do that for the rest of my life. That is that like the idea of doing something 40, 50 hours a week for your entire life that you legitimately hate, like you loathe, is a really scary thing to me. Like, it's actually
Yeah,
terrifying. There's a lot of people
terrifying.
out there. Exactly. There's a lot of people out there that do that. They live for the weekend. That is terrifying to me. So at that point in time, that was the big transition for me where it's like, I know what I love to do. I need to gain some experience doing it. So let's do everything in my power to change that. And at that point in time, after he said that, and I decided I wanted to coach, I needed a coach. This is the only thing I've really found in my life that I truly love. Like I can't stop thinking about kind of thing. That's when I started making it a point to work more hours, to attend more seminars, get as much materials as I can from strength coaches in the area I look up to study like hell. Like one of the people that actually influenced me quite a bit was actually Brandon Sen, who's a other Brandon here, who's the he's other Brandon here. He's in charge of athlete experience now. But he started giving me all these resources, just resources left and right. Hey, you should read this book. Hey, you should study this. Hey, you should take this seminar, this course. And I started just spending every free moment I had in education, just digging into everything I could. Whenever Chris Duffin would let me annoy him, I'd take him aside and I'd ask him a series of different questions. And by the way, was incredibly helpful with how busy of a guy he was. He actually let me bother him more than I think I would have in his position. So that was really cool too. But yeah, at that point in time, I completely transitioned to education, doing everything I can to develop my career in something I'm actually passionate about. And at which point in time, I realized to be an effective strength coach, you can't be an introvert, and you got to learn to speak or speak in front of a crowd. You have to do decent with public speaking. Most of the good strength coaches I know of are also pretty damn good public speakers. So I
Yeah,
started developing that skill as well. I actually volunteered for a series of different public speaking events and things like that in my university. The first few, I felt like I was literally going to shit my pants. It was terrible. I stuttered constantly. I sounded like damn Elmer Fudd. It was not great. But the more I did it, the better I got. And then at this point in time, I'm putting on seminars in front of hundreds, if not, a few times thousands of people. And it doesn't really bother me. So it was a complete transition. So I just kind of trial by fire, threw myself into it, complete transition. And it's benefited me in unbelievable ways since.
yeah. It's funny, isn't it, that motivation can often be split into motivation towards something or motivation away from something.
Yeah.
And if you've been given the prospect of roofing for the next 40 years at a 50-hour week, if that doesn't light a fire under your ass to fucking find out what you love, then I don't know what will. And that was your incentive to then go out and really hammer the challenges of overcoming, stuff like public speaking. And you speak very well. I've seen you a lot of your material, and you orate very well with your strength stuff and your education stuff. Very clear, but it's very interesting for people that are listening and watching to know that you developed that partly out of the terror of being a full-time roofer, but also because you realized you made the connection that to be a good coach, I think a good coach in anything, you have to be good at orating and articulating what you're trying to communicate. And if you can't do that, you're really on an uphill battle. We've all met the aspiring strength coach with a zillion letters after their name fresh out of university, and they can't fucking ask you how you are.
Yeah.
And it's awful. And you think you're never going to get anywhere like that.
Yeah.
If you can't build rapport or even just communicate clearly and shake someone's hand and say, hello, nice to meet you, what's your name? Then good fucking luck, because your day is going to be spent talking to people, especially in strength coaching, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And for me, like my first few years of college or even towards the end of high school, the biggest mistake I make is I label myself an introvert. When
Right.
you label yourself an introvert, you will fall into the characteristics and the behaviors of an introvert.
Right.
I'd preface every conversation with, hey, you know, I like you, but I'm an introvert. So I can't hang out. I can't do this. I can't do that. Like it was, I really fell into that label.
Wow.
And the more I fell into it, the more recluse I became. And at a certain point in time, I realized it was me deciding I'm an introvert that
Yeah.
caused me to be a worse introvert. So once I got into the mentality of like, and for me, I used a wrestling strategy. In wrestling, one of the biggest things that I developed that helped me like crazy in life is during the worst weight cut you can possibly imagine, 20, 25 pounds at, $170, which is a big percentage of your weight. Just ridiculous weight cuts. One of the biggest things I do is, man, I love this shit. I fucking love this shit. I can do this all day. And like, I'd get out of the sauna just dead, feeling, I mean, anybody that's cut weight or hasn't cut weight rather, you can't really explain what it's like to someone that hasn't cut weight. It's really miserable in a way you cannot fathom.
Yeah.
And with that being said, to develop the skill in those conditions to hop out of the sauna for 5 minutes, knowing you got to go back in for 15, you're 16 pounds down, got 3 more pounds to go. Those last few pounds are the worst. And by the time those 5 minutes are up, you're like, fuck you, I'm excited to get back in. Let's get back in. A part of it becomes true. A part of it becomes true when you transition to that mentality. Is it true? Fuck no. But a part of it does, and it becomes a hell of a lot easier to do. So I did that on the reverse end of things with being an introvert. And then once I started getting out of that, realizing that public speaking is a big part of the life I want to live, I started telling myself, I'm an extrovert. I love this shit. I can talk to people all day. I love talking to people, all backgrounds. Working in a commercial gym, man, I had to converse with some people that were hard to speak to. Let me tell you, a lot of strength coaches out there want to skip over the part of working in a commercial gym. They're like, I'm too good for that. Or, I don't want to do that for the rest of your life. No shit. But it's, man, do you develop a lot of skills? And the biggest of which is becoming an extrovert. Biggest of which is learning to talk to masses of people from backgrounds of all kinds. And the more I told myself I'm an extrovert, the more I threw myself into a really high client load in a commercial setting. That really developed me, and it became true.
Yeah, that's fascinating that you took the wrestling mindset. I'm going to use that. I love this shit. Next time I go through a struggle, I'll remember the B Morg's advice of I love that shit. Yeah, I'm a big believer in shocks actually to create change. And the shock of you being told that you're going to be a roofer for the rest of your life promoted a change. And I'm also a big believer on the introvert extrovert kind of continuum, that introverts, whether you label yourself or not, some people just are naturally less talkative. You can become a contextual extrovert if you do your fucking homework on the context you want to be good at talking about. And for you, it was your strength work, it was your coaching, and you went deep down that. And suddenly you could talk for hours on end about your training, about your principles, about everything you love to do with strength. I'm similar. I'm very similar like that. I learned that I could talk about the things I liked ad nauseum.
Yeah.
Maybe not so much the things I didn't like, but again, working in commercial gym and office building gym settings, I learned how to develop the skill of talking to difficult people, or people that I didn't have anything in common with, or that weren't there for the reasons I were there, blah, blah, blah. You combine that together, talking to difficult people and being a contextual extrovert, suddenly you've got a really good communicative skill set there, right? Where you can now really articulate your information, especially as someone as big into education as yourself. You can now articulate that out there to anyone that wants to listen, and ultimately, change shit for the better. So I think, yeah, if anyone's listening or watching that considers themselves like you were under the label of introversion, go and find what it is that you like and become a contextual extrovert around that topic, and watch how your world just opens up, right? Doors will open up. And I really like what you said about, relationships then started forming because of your networking efforts in college or university areas now, and then they've now become fruitful to this day. So I think that's massive. Yeah, it's a really nice sort of encouraging words to the self-labeling introverts out there.
Yeah. I literally could not have said that better. I've actually never heard that term before, contextual extrovert. That's exactly what happened. And
Yeah,
now I'm actually reflecting on it more. And I couldn't have said it better. I love what you just said there, by the way. I really like that. But with that being said, I couldn't have done it unless I had that mindset change. And this is one of the few times you'll ever hear me say it. I am still an introvert. I don't admit it often. I am still an introvert. I'll admit it now, here and now, and here only. But like you said, I'm a contextual extrovert, and I didn't get the opportunity to do that until I learned my shit.
yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah, go and read the books and talk to people about what it is you've been reading, and you'll be surprised, right, of how much you can actually talk, bypassing any insecurities or labels that you thought you had. Yeah, that's
absolutely.
fantastic. And anyone that watches your stuff, they'll see now that you do have a degree of extroversion and expertise in your area, if not lots of areas now, as you've matured and as you're getting older. I think that's a fantastic encouragement story. It's a great place to finish up. If people want to work with you, they want to follow you, find out, your Instagram and how to work with you, Brandon, how can they do that?
Yeah. So at any given time, you can go to kabukistrength.com. My email's on there. Email's Brandon_Morgan at kabukistrength.com. You can sign up for coaching through Kabuki Strength. You can reach out to me, but my primary way of conversing and communicating is probably Instagram, just because, I mean, the fitness industry, Instagram, goes hand in hand for sure. So bmorg33. I don't say my handle very often. I think that's it. So yeah, you can find me on there, shoot me a message, watch some of the educational material we put out, because we put out a lot, and it's always developing, it's always getting better, just like we are as a company. So yeah, feel free to reach out, ask any questions you have, or sign up for coaching, because I'd love to work with you.
Fantastic. Yeah, this has been a great chat. I really appreciate you taking time out of the coaching day, mate. And as soon as those borders open, I will be in a vehicle on my way down to Portland. I think I'd love to
Absolutely.
come and meet you guys and get some coaching, and who knows, maybe even help you on a couple of backflips.
Please do.
Fantastic. This episode of the Move Mind podcast was brought to you by CBD Mountain, the sport and fitness CBD. Head over to cbdmountain.com for a range of soft gels, skin balms, oils, and vapes, and purchase online and have the premium quality CBD delivered directly to your door. cbdmountain.com.